of years ago, I was hanging out in Brisbane and catching up with some friends. And we went out to a venue, I think, and we were walking back home to where we were staying. And anyway, so there's a couple of cars came past, about 2 or 3 cars drove past. And one of our group members, I don't think it was me, did like a sign that they shouldn't have done to the people in the car. Okay, that was definitely not me. Anyway, so the car, thinking the cars would just keep on driving past, but the cars stopped. And there was 4 of us, 2 guys, myself, another guy, and 2 girls. And we're walking along in this dark street trying to get back to where we were staying. And these cars literally stopped, and these guys got out of the car and were obviously very angry that someone in the group, who shall remain nameless, did this sign to them, right? Which they must have misinterpreted as a rude gesture. So they got out and they literally started chasing after us. And I realised that it was no longer a joke when not only did the first group of guys get out of the car, the next group of guys got out of the car as well and came after us. So we bolted and we ran as fast as we could, and my heart started pounding. I started, freaking out, and we found this garage door of this home that was open. No idea whose house it was, and there was a car parked in the garage. And so what we did was we ran in behind. It was all dark. We ran in behind the car, crouched down, because these guys were walking up and down the street, calling out all sorts of stuff. They were very aggressive. I thought I just don't want to come into contact with these guys. And we hid behind this car in this garage. And that was our safety. And we just were quiet as anything until eventually they got back in their cars and they drove off. And if it wasn't for that garage door that was open, that car that was in the way, who knows how that would have turned out. Tonight, we see in this passage, Jesus is talking about himself as the gate to safety for the sheep. And it's an amazing picture. We see in these I am statements, Jesus talks about I am the bread of life and he's the light of the world. And we've got all these cool I am statements that Jesus makes. And the next one, he says, I am the gate. What is that? What does he mean when he says, I am the gate? Isn't that odd? It's kind of bizarre for Jesus to call himself a gate or a door. But the fascinating thing about this is, I think you're going to love this because this blew me away in learning about it. It's this direct link back into the Old Testament about Jesus' own identity as the Son of God, his deity, his sonship, his divine identity. So if we go for just a minute back into Exodus chapter 3, where we see God speaking to Moses, and he's having this conversation with Moses, and God is saying, hey, Moses, guess what? I'm going to send you to the Pharaoh. I'm going to send you to the Pharaoh, and you're going to tell him that he needs to release the people from captivity, my people from captivity. So Moses wants to inquire about this because he's not quite sure. He wants to know what exactly he's got to do. All right, so he says to God, so you're saying that I need to go to these people and I need to say to them that you are telling them to release, you're telling Pharaoh to release your people. Is that right, God? And God's like, yeah, that's exactly what I want you to do. That's what I'm telling you to do. And Moses checks in and back again. Just let me see if I've got this right, God. You want me to go, so what is it that you want me to say to them? And so God unpacks it with Moses a little bit more in Exodus chapter 3. And he says to him, hey, I want you to tell them that I sent you. Exodus chapter 3 and verse 10 to 14. Tell them that I sent you and you're under my authority for my people to be released from captivity. Okay. But what if and so Moses goes back in again one more time. But what if they ask me, what's your name? And God says, tell them I am who I am. Tell them I am who I am. Tell them that I am sent you. Okay? Now this term I am comes from the Hebrew term Yahweh, which means provider. And so what we see here in this, Jesus using this I am statement, there's this beautiful link that connects so powerfully with his identity back into the Old Testament when God is saying, you're going to tell them I am who I am. Tell them I am has sent you. And so we see this again happening in the New Testament when Jesus is before Pilate. Okay? So he's before Pilate and they're going to crucify him. And so Pilate says to the crowd, first of all, he says to the crowd, okay, so why are you bringing this guy here? What's the accusation? Well, he's claiming, so the Jewish leaders brought Jesus to Pilate, and he says to him, so what's this about? He says, well, he's claiming to be a king. He's claiming to be a king, and, that's not on. We're not okay with that, so we want you to crucify him. And so Pilate addresses Jesus, has a chat with Jesus, and he says to him, so are you a king then? So let's just clear this up. So are you a king? And Jesus says to him, it is as you say that I am. That I am. So these beautiful, powerful links to Christ's identity. And Jesus identifies himself in his response. And in these ways that he's identifying himself as I am. And if you see those links, you see how powerful this is. The bread of life and the light of the world and the way and the truth and the life and the good shepherd, the gate. Whoever enters through the gate will be saved. I'm going to share with you some powerful stuff that links again into the Old Testament and also into first century Palestine in terms of the practice of shepherding that makes a wonderful connection with this stuff. But I want to ask you first of all though, I wonder if you've entered in through him tonight. Is your life secure in Christ like that? And how do you know? Do you just assume that it is? Or is it based on the act of actually laying down your life and receiving Christ personally? So here we have this powerful picture of this shepherd and the pen. And it is so powerful when you start to see the links that are there. So we have this shepherd, we have a sheep, we have the pen, we have the gate, the shepherd who's the gatekeeper. Okay. Now he opens the gate for the sheep to come in. Okay, so he opens the gate for the sheep to come in. And the beautiful thing is, we see in that passage in John 10 that the sheep hear his voice and they know his voice. They know his voice. So the sheep are like, nah, if they hear another person's voice, they're like, nah, that's not my shepherd. They hear their shepherd's voice, they're like, yeah, that's the voice of my shepherd. And they know his voice and they follow him because they recognize the shepherd's voice. So sometimes shepherds even named their sheep. That's how close and personal the relationship was. I wonder if you, I actually did a little bit of a search online so if I had a sheep, what would I name my sheep? I wonder if you guys had a sheep, what would you name your sheep? Here's a couple that I found. And I hope you enjoy them. One of them was obviously you've got Billy the sheep. You've got Nanny or Pan or Lambert or Woolly or maybe even Bo Peep. You could name your sheep, right? Okay, now how about these silly, maybe you've got a goat, silly goat names, right? Scapegoat, Vincent Van Goat, Butthead, Billy the Kid or Batinsky. I like Vincent Van Goat. I don't know about you guys, that one's great. What about silly sheep names, right? Get this one, right? You've got Barbaran or Barnabas or Bartholomew. So they're silly sheep names, okay? Or you could just go with a basic sheep name that makes sense, kind of like Curly, Fluffy, Fuzzy, or even Cuddles. But give Cuddles would be a good one, I reckon, Robbie. See, the thing is, guys, Jews who heard, I know you're all laughing inside, by the way. So, Jews who heard these words of Jesus, I am the good shepherd, I am the gate, and so on, would have thought back in their minds, in their history, like this. Back to the Old Testament kings like David, who were fondly thought of as shepherds of Israel, okay? Shepherds of Israel. Now, shepherds, they didn't use dogs or machinery or anything like that to shepherd or herd their sheep. Instead, they walked ahead of their sheep. They walked ahead of their sheep. And they called their sheep to follow them. So they walked with and ahead of their sheep, and they called them. See, shepherding in first century Palestine was it's a relational occupation. The shepherds didn't just sort of clock on and count down the hours until it was time to go home, put in their timesheet and off they go. They lived with their sheep and they got to know them personally. That's why the sheep knew the voice of their own shepherd. And in this relationship, there was trust and there was care. There was protection. There was love. The shepherds loved their sheep. And here we see Jesus, he's saying in verse 5, he's saying the sheep, they're not going to follow a stranger because they don't know the stranger's voice. They're not going to connect with that stranger at all. You see, the sheep pen, so what happened was, if you picture the sheep pen for a minute, the sheep pen was used during winter nights to protect the sheep against lions and wolves and any predator that might come to harm the sheep. Now here's where it gets really incredible, guys. This is where it blew me away. So we know the shepherd has a vested interest in the sheep, right? So and when I said that the sheep know the voice, a shepherd could literally separate a group of sheep. So there might be multiple, groups of sheep kind of all flocking together. A shepherd could call out his own sheep simply with his voice in amongst a larger, say, group of sheep. They might be grazing together, and simply by calling to them, they would turn around and follow him. That was how powerful it was. They knew their voice, and because the sheep relied on the shepherd for shelter and food and safety and protection. You get that metaphor. It's so powerful, and that's what Jesus is drawing on. Okay, now here's what happened. When the sheep would return to the pen at night, okay, the shepherd, after a day of grazing, and they're tired and they're weary, they've been out all day, the shepherd's been out all day, they've been out grazing, and the shepherd would count every one of them as they went through the door, as they went through that gate, right? So the shepherd would physically stand there and count his sheep off and number them as they went through the gate into the pen. And here's what happened next. So what he would do is he would anoint any who were scratched and wounded, and he would give water to any of his sheep that were thirsty. Okay, and now here's what he did. After that happened, after the sheep were counted, and he was confident that all of them were there, what the shepherd would then do is he would physically lay his body down across the doorway of the sheep pen. He would physically lay his body down right across the doorway where the gate was. And so in that sense, he physically became the gateway into the sheep. He became the gateway into the sheep. And so he would lay down at night so that if anyone was going to come anywhere near those sheep, he'd know about it. If anyone was going to try and attack those sheep or steal those sheep or harm those sheep, that shepherd would know about it. So there was no intruder getting through. What he's saying is, if you want to come into these sheep, you're going to have to come through me. Because here I am, right? There's no other way in. If you want to come in to my sheep, to my flock of sheep, you're going to have to come through me. Okay? And so can you see in here the sense of ownership, the sense of protection, this sense of these are my sheep. These are my sheep. The shepherd had this vested interest in their safety, and he literally became the gateway to the sheep. And here's what Jesus is saying, right? He's saying, I am that gate. I am that gate. And what happens when the sheep enter into the pen? They find rest. They find protection. They find security. They find safety. They find, in one sense, they find home. They find home. And in verse 11 it says, Jesus says, the good shepherd lays down his life for his sheep. He lays down his life for his sheep. What Jesus says to us is, I lay down my life for you. So in the verse, he flips back and forward from the metaphor to a personal connection with you and I. He's talking, okay? And so in what he's saying is, Jesus is saying, I lay down, I'm the gate. I'm laying my life down across in front of you, because no one's going to come through and get to you unless they come through me. And in John 10:18, Jesus actually says, I choose to lay down my life. I have the authority to lay it down or take it up. And it's the Father's will that I lay down my life. Jesus has authority in our salvation. It rests in him alone. In our salvation. He says the sheep, us, you and I, we come in and we find safety and security and protection. Look at that picture. Now come with me back into the Old Testament for just a second. In Psalm 80 verse 1, God is called the shepherd over Israel. He's called the shepherd over Israel. So in claiming to be the good shepherd, Jesus is asserting himself, his own leadership over a flock that he's willing to lay down his life for. And that's you and I. The picture is so powerful when you put those two things together. So with these, the listeners would have been like, wow, he's saying that he is the gate. He's like that shepherd that lays down in front of the sheep to protect them and provide them with security. But Jesus takes it one step further and he says, for you, I am the gateway to your salvation. I'm the gateway to your salvation. See, then he goes on to say that the hired hand, guess what? The hired hand, right? He's not the shepherd. He has no vested interest in the sheep. He just comes and goes. Okay? He just comes and goes. He isn't willing to leave the 99 and go after the one like Jesus does. That's what Christ does for us. I want you to imagine, for example, for a minute, that this group of people represented the 99. Okay? And one of us, for some reason, was really struggling. And for some reason stepped away from their faith. And struggled and had a really difficult time. What Jesus is saying, what we know of Jesus is that he's willing to leave the rest of us in that safety of that pen and go after that one and track them down and bring them back. Because he goes after the one. God cares for the one. God cares for the ones. God cares for you. He loves you very, very much. And so when we're struggling, when we're going through a difficult time, when we're facing something that we don't know how to handle, he cares. And he wants you to turn, and me to turn to him in that. He goes, I want you to just get that mental picture in your head. You're feeling defeated, you're feeling confused, you're feeling I've had enough, and you sort of see yourself just walking, stepping away, and Jesus is coming after you, and he's putting his hand on your shoulder, and he's saying, it's all right, we can do this together. And in verse 8, Jesus says, look, all who've come before me, they're just thieves and robbers, right? And what he's referring to there is really interesting again. He's referring to these self-appointed leaders in Israel. You see, the Messiah, the people in Israel, they knew the Messiah was coming, right? The one who would restore God's chosen people to God. But they didn't know who, and they didn't know when. They didn't know those two, but they knew that the prophecy was real and that one day it would be fulfilled. In Jeremiah 23:5, it says this, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up for David a righteous branch, and he, capital H, will reign as king and act wisely and do justice and righteousness in the land. Here's another prophecy about Jesus coming. And it's so powerful. It says, I want to raise up for David a righteous branch, a king who will act justly and do righteousness in the land. So the Messiah, and here's a powerful thing, we know the Messiah was to come through the line of David, which Jesus came through. But people would rock up in first century Palestine, they'd claim to be the Messiah. They'd claim to be the one, right? And what Jesus is saying is, they're thieves and robbers. Don't listen to them. Don't listen to them, because they'll lead you astray. They'll lead you astray. They won't lead you to the truth. And they don't have your best interests at heart. They're false messiahs and false messengers, and we're not to listen to their voices. And this is so powerful with Jesus saying that his sheep, us, we hear his voice. I wonder in our context, if we were to think about that just for a minute, what would be our false shepherds, for example? Our maybe, false leaders or false gods even in our lives. I wonder what we think those kinds of things would be. What about, and what voices that they sort of present as to us? What about the voice of success at all costs? What about the voice of power and control? What about the voice of jealousy maybe? The voice of materialism? Or the voice of putting myself first? Or the voice of mistrust? Or the voice of gossip even? Any of those things can be voices that mislead us from God's purposes in our lives, Any of those things can be the enemy's attempt to steer us away from what God has in store for us as individual people, as families, as a community, as a church, Jesus says, he says, I am the gate. I am that gate to safety, to salvation. I am the gate that if you enter through me, you'll be saved. If you enter through me, through Jesus Christ, then you'll be saved. In Matthew 7, it says this, in 13 and 14, it says, enter through the narrow gate. Enter through the narrow gate. For wide is the gate, and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it, right? Many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow is the way to salvation, the way that leads to life, and only a few find it. See, Jesus says, my sheep, my people, enter the kingdom through me. He doesn't give any other option. He doesn't give any other alternative. He doesn't give any other. We can't sit down and explore this because Jesus says, I'm the gate. I'm the way that you need to enter and be saved. And in that last verse, Jesus says, hey, that thief, he comes to kill and to destroy. Those messages, those false messages in our lives, they want to tear us down. They want to rip us apart. And the enemy wants to use that to undermine our faith in Christ. Those things, sometimes when we take offense to something that someone does or says, when we get upset and we harbor something in our hearts and we let that hurt fester and sort of, fester and build within us. Or when we hear something that somebody else has said. Somebody else has said, oh, did you know that person said this or that person did that? All these things can distract us and lead us away from God's best and God's purposes in our lives. And the enemy, Satan, can use those things to really undermine and draw us away from Christ and to take us down. You see, here's the thing I want to finish on, guys. When sheep have access to the pasture and to the pen, they have access to food and water. They have all their needs met. They don't want for anything else. Then they do exactly what they're supposed to. Jesus, in his death on the cross, he provides us access to God, to our Creator, to the love of God. And that's what he does. It's as though we enter in through Jesus into the safety and security that God has for us in our eternal life. In the eternity that God has established for us in Jesus Christ. And Jesus did that in his death on the cross. He paid the price for that confidence, for our security, for our purpose, and for our destiny to become a reality. And he is willing to meet our every need, to supply our every need. Now, he doesn't guarantee that life's going to be easy. He doesn't guarantee that it's all going to be rosy and just everything's going to be happiness every day. That's not what the promise is. The promise is, I am with you. The promise is, I love you. The promise is, I will walk with you through those difficult times. And I think that, because when we truly have our needs met in him, here's where we find the difference. Here's where we find the difference that only Jesus can give. In purpose and meaning and hope and in vision and in truth and in value, He values us so much that he would lay his life down in forgiveness and compassion and care and kindness and all those things. See, because it's only in him, in his strength, that we can really do that with someone else. Love someone else the way God intended. Forgive someone else the way God intended. Trust someone else the way God intended. Those kinds of things.